In other words, workers were freed, more or less freed from the factory, but the entire society became a social factory, right? And that's the situation where here we are, and the situation also of the relation of people between themselves is going to change, and that's what we have been teaching this year, which is the intrusion, the eruption of what we call consumer society. Basically, the consumer society was a transfer of what Marxists call the exploitation and extraction of surplus value from workers themselves in a relation of production and a production object that will be commodified. All this is transferred to society at large, where workers were going to be exploited in a kind of a positive way by turning them into happy consumers. And the surplus value would be extracted not from the production itself, but for the consumption. The advent of the consumer society was then partly due to the reaction to the resistance of, let's say, workers in Sardinia to the assembly line in the Fiat factories, who refused to work entirely in a condition of total slavery. So there was a reaction to that, but it was also allowed by the intensification of technological progress and the possibility of replacing manual labor by a technological labor. So, work, in other words, the whole thing was accompanied by a phenomenal expansion of media culture, and that's what I want to talk about. Work spilled through the anti-social factory. The workers were now quoted by the system, which extracted surplus value from consumption and not from production. Impervious to these momentous changes, classical Marxist theorists were fast becoming obsolete. Few of them dared to update dialectical materialism to the dematerializing situation that was happening. They didn't acknowledge for what it was the increasing reproduction of capital itself in the form of social relation. It was what Baudrillard called the end of production. The end of production does mean that nothing replaced it. Marxists still dismiss the new powerful reproductive forces like the media and dismiss them as mere superstructures, a technical conduit for a dominant ideology. Marx never included language, science, communication among productive forces, except for certain very illuminating allusion in the Grundrisse, the manuscript of this Hegelian period, which were rediscovered in the 60s. Even a liberal German Marxist like Hans Eisensberger could still consider the media as nothing but the industry of consciousness and limit their role to information and propaganda. I have to remind you that consciousness was an important factor in Marxism because the proletarian class didn't exist. It had constantly to be shaped through teaching, through indoctrination, through a number of knowledge that was given to the workers for them to realize that their work was not something that was given, but their work was a means by which the capitalist system was extracting a surplus value out of them, and also alienating to their own work the way the consumer society was going to alienate consumers because they would be separated from the very object that they supposed to desire, because the object were turning into signs, and they were in fact desiring not the object but the signs, the whole background that we've explored in class up to now. So, Baudrillard wrote a piece called Requiem for the Media in 1972, where he acknowledged the first, he made his intervention in the realm of the media in two parts. The first one was the Requiem for the Media, which is a small text, and the second one would be the implosion of the media. The implosion of the social in the media. So in the first text that he wrote early on in 1972, 72 is the date of publication on Oedipus. It is the first production of new French theorists coming out of the failed revolution, a revolution which has failed socially, failed politically, but not failed in the sense that it gave French theory a new impetus and also a need to go beyond the Marxist themes that had been accepted until then, among them the class struggle. In 1968, the class struggle didn't work because the working class didn't move, and or move very late, or move for other reasons than the students wanted them to move, and the revolution happened in a few days and kind of evaporated after a few days. So something had happened that forced them to rethink the relation between social forces and capitalism, and maybe even the idea of revolution itself. That's why French theory, in all its varieties, was some sort of aftershock of May 68. As I said, May 68 was some sort of failure in France because the whole society closed down, and after a few years make it such that French theory wouldn't have any sort of audience anymore. But the philosophy that they created at the time were not created for France, but was created for the world, and that's why it hasn't finished yet having its impact, but we're still confronted with this seductive enemy called capitalism. Okay, so in Requiem for the Media, Baudrillard acknowledged Enzensberger's belated effort to close the immense gap, as he said, that separated Marxism from a socialist theory of the media. Contrary to other Marxist philosophers who denounce the media as a crude form of ideological manipulation, Enzensberger welcomed the rise of a new reproductive formations. Although mostly used at the time to further bourgeois ideology, the media, he thought, would eventually be reclaimed for the dominant class and returned to their natural destination. After all, Enzensberger argued, its practical means are in the hands of the mass themselves, end quote. In due time, he thought, a democratic instrument such as this one was bound to offer a veritable medium of communication. This optimism was founded on the socializing effect of the media. Enzensberger didn't realize that socialization could simultaneously induce widespread indeterminacy and anxiety. Considered as a form, and not just in terms of changeable contents, the media actually enforced a relation of abstraction and separation among the masses. I haven't developed that, but that's the critique that was provided at the time and simultaneously by the situationist. Isolation and passivity among the audience, who were separate from any possibility of action and were reduced as being a consumer in a society without having any means of intervening. Okay, in this, Baudrillard remained close to the situationist analysis of society of spectacle. A one-way communication forbade any real response. But, unlike them, Baudrillard didn't believe that what could reclaim one's consciousness. In other words, it was impossible to instill consciousness in workers anymore because the workers were not organized in such a way that the class could persevere. The consumer society, in this term, was an attempt to eradicate classes in society. I would say it was a second attempt. The first attempt was fascism. The second one was consumerism. And we could discuss that if we want later. Briefly, in both cases, it was an erasure of classes by the top or by the bottom. Baudrillard didn't believe that we could reclaim one's consciousness, however fleetingly, through concerted drifts and disorientation. The situationists were trying to save their souls. Baudrillard was trying to go for the code. Alone among French intellectuals, he had paid close attention to Marshall McLuhan, the first contemporary thinker to envisage the media as a new form of environment. But Baudrillard's conclusion was exactly opposite to McLuhan.